We have something in common. Both born in the same year, Mr. Meadows.
Yeah, I would never have believed it.
Actually, it was a year when tea wasn't rationed anymore, which is another sort of silly thing that popped into my head the other day. But the old cliche about photography is that once you were 11 years of age, you started taking photographs. The cliche is true as far as I'm concerned. I did start taking photographs when I was about 11 with an Instamatic camera. What was your sort of first foray into photography?
I can remember it very well. My mother had a Brownie box camera, literally a black box, which I think was pre-war, and it took 120 film. And in 1962-63, so I was about to be 11.
Yes, indeed.
There was that bad
oh, yes,
winter,
yes.
62-63. And the snow filled the roads between the hedges, and it was 4, 5, 6 feet deep in places, drifting in, and people couldn't get in and out of the village. And they were storing milk in people's baths, and we were running out of bread and things. And we had to be dug out by the army. And my mother said, "Take the camera, darling. Take a picture, see what you can photograph." And I took a picture of one of the gamekeepers with a shotgun over his arm, standing beside one of the snowdrifts to give some idea of the height of it. And I think that was the first time that I actually thought about the picture I was going to take and how to do it. And that's the first time I can remember taking a picture. I mean, I'm sure as a child someone had maybe handed me a camera or something, but it was the first time I actually did it and made a picture.
And what was the progression then with photography?
The real urge to become a photographer happened when I was 18, because I was sent away to boarding schools. I was in boarding schools from the age of 8. And really, once that happens to you, you know you're kind of on your own. And also you're separate from the rest of the world in this kind of so-called privileged bubble. Although I have to say, I wonder what the privilege is, because they were essentially mean-spirited places, very Spartan, and cruel. Yes, I think they probably were. But certainly by modern standards, but they were cruel at the time. They were pretty cruel places. And they were single-sex. So, by the time I was a teenager in the 60s, people were listening to Hendrix, and the Vietnam War was on, and the Paris riots, student protests, all of that stuff that kind of should have been part of my making as a teenager in the mid-60s, Bob Dylan and the Beatles and so on, was all happening on someone else's TV set, It wasn't happening in my life, not really. So by the time I was 18, I was angry. I was still at school, but I'd been sent back because I kept failing exams. So I then started failing exams on purpose to kind of punish everybody around me. Yeah, I was really more than quite angry, but fizzing with curiosity about the world and having nowhere to put all that frustration and energy. I could feel it inside. And I saw two things. One was Beautiful, Beautiful, the omnibus documentary in October 1969 on the television set, BBC. Mm-hmm. Beautiful, Beautiful was a documentary about photography. It had Don McCullin in it, and it had Bruce Davidson in it.
Yes.
And I remember Bruce Davidson walking across some, I think they were rooftops, an asphalt roof in Harlem with a 5.4, I don't know whether it was a Sinar, but anyway, some kind of a large format camera. And he was trying to photograph his way through East 100th Street, one
block at a time.
Yeah. And I just thought, wow, this is what photography can help you to do, is to catch up on all these years where I've been locked up, basically, like I've been kept a prisoner in these pusillanimous boarding schools. Class-ridden, elitist, they were miserable. So I saw that and I thought, wow, here's a little door, I could go through that door. It's called photography. And then the next summer at the Hayward Gallery in London, I saw the Bill Brandt exhibition.
Yeah, yes.
And that really blew my socks off, you know. And for lots and lots of reasons, it blew my socks off. I saw what photographers could do. You know, he was photographing people. He was photographing... His documentary work from the 1930s was such an eye-opener to me. But what really, really hit me about Brandt was that he was using his camera like a passport to slip in and out of the different social classes. And so, you know, when I saw those pictures put together in pairs, you know, so on one page you'd have, I don't know, some pictures of some miners coming up out of a cage out of a hole in the ground in South Wales, and then next to it, the picture, as it were, on the opposite page, or you know, mounted like pairs of pictures that'd be, I don't know, a lot of old toffs in some London club, you know, or be a picture of somebody scrubbing a doorstep in a northern town on the wet pavement, and then next to that you'd have, you know, I don't know, they'd be maids serving silver service in a posh house in Eaton Square or something. And I thought the same photographer was in both of these places. And the idea that you could do that, and that photography allowed you to do that.
Did you share any of these thoughts with anybody, or were they just personal things that were
No,
going on?
I did, yeah. I talked to my art master at school, Mr. Twombly, who is one of the few decent, well, probably the only decent master, but he was also the only working class master in the school, which was quite interesting. And he was encouraging, and he said you could go to art school. And so I started applying to art school, but then I immediately began to regret that I'd failed so many exams, because I didn't have physics O-level, and all of, you know, the Polytechnic in London, and I think Derby as well at that time, both needed physics O-level. But Manchester Polytechnic didn't, and I applied to Manchester Polytechnic, and that's why I went there. They accepted me. They were the only place that would accept me.
It's funny you talking about your art master. It was kind of exactly the same with me, but my art master was called Mr. Snelling, and I used to walk to school. I was about 1.5 miles, and I was always late because I didn't enjoy school very much. But Mr. Snelling was always late, and he had a green Morris 1000, and he used to give me a lift. And he would talk about artists, and he would show me books about artists and how they used light. And I don't think he was well regarded within the school. He was a bit of an outsider.
At my school, you had to fail at everything before you were allowed to do art.
Yes.
I mean, I rebelled we all had to be in the cadets, and there was a celebrated day when there was some grand inspection, and all these sort of very dressed professional soldiers came, and they all had faces like beetroots, you know, and these very polished shoes and brasses and medals and stuff, and they inspected us all and things. And then, I don't know, some officer came, and I was supposedly in charge of the RAF section, and I remember jumping to attention at the wrong moment, saluting and saying, "Permission to speak, sir." I thought he was going to burst out of his collar, you know, and he said, "What is it? What is it, Sergeant?" And I said, "Please, sir, I've become a pacifist, sir." And honestly, you know, you could have, I don't know, I thought the sky was going to split in half, you know. And then I thought, this is it, I'm dead now. And immediately I heard someone jump to attention behind me. Little piping voice says, "Permission to speak, sir." "What is it, Corporal?" She says, "Please, sir, I've become a pacifist too, sir." Brilliant. Anyway, we were taken aside, and we were basically told that we were to be absent from the school on Cadets' Day, the Army Day, Military Day, which was every Wednesday, and that we were to be given to the art master, who was going to sort us out. And Mr. Twombly said, "Well, you know, the only thing we can think of for you to do outside of the school, because you've got to get out, you know, we've got to get you out of here on those days, is to send you to life classes at Bath Art School." It was 1969, 1970, and you know, there were all these guys in caftans and long hair and sitting around smoking roll-ups, and we were there in our suits. And you know, I remember the first time this woman took her clothes off, and you know, I mean, I was just like this for 2 hours. I just smoked cigarettes. made myself sick. I just didn't know what to do. I didn't draw anything. And I thought, yeah, well, maybe art could be something we could do. And I remember talking with Mr. Twombly, and we talked a lot about photography because I'd seen the Bill Brandt, and we were talking about that. And then he said, well, you can study photography now for 3 years at art school, and maybe that's what you'd like to do. So without him, I wouldn't have thought to do it. Yeah.
So Manchester Polytechnic?
Yes.
No physics?
It was a very interesting time. The man who ran it was called Jack Tate, and he happens now to live in Abergavenny, and I see him from time to time. He's in his 80s. Jack was in charge of a school of photography that had been assembled from different colleges, really, because the Polytechnic was still in its first year. And they'd assembled this, an art college and a teacher training college and a science institute, and they'd kind of pulled these things together as one institution. Mm-hmm. And they had this 3-year photography course. And so we had Dr. George Wakefield, who was a most marvellous man, but he was a photo technician supreme. He was, I think, the first PhD in photo science in this country, and he wrote he had a weekly column in the in Amateur Photographer. There was a guy called John Fisher who always wore a kind of fisherman's caftan, had a beard, and I remember at my interview he sat cross-legged on the floor putting glass balls into polythene bags all through my interview. And didn't speak as I remember. And then, then there was a wonderful guy, Alan Murgatroyd, who was really a filmmaker, but he was a rather good photographer, who was the documentary sort of person, but he was only part-time. So a real mixture of different people with different skills, and they bundled all of these people together and kind of cobbled classes around the available people. But the essential drive was to produce commercial photographers who were going to work in studios. You're going to work your way up through being an assistant, and then, so on. I knew that I didn't want to be in a studio.
Have you always been a rebel then from day one?
Not really, no. I didn't feel I was a rebel at Manchester Poly. I felt I was a fish out of water. I was a southern boy, posh southern boy living in the north, yes, with a lot of working class people. I did get a grant though, not a full grant, but we did get grants in those days, and all my tuition fees were paid, and we were living as cheaply as we could mostly in working class communities. And it was like, it's a fantastic adventure for me to be out there, And I could, as a photographer who was edging all the time, say, I want to be out. I don't want to be in the studio. I want to be outside. And having one or two members of staff who kind of supported me in doing that. And the only other person on the course who felt the same was Martin Parr. We just became chums because we both wanted to work out of doors, and we felt if there were two of us arguing for that, then we'd stand a better chance. Yeah, and we did start to do projects together.
Right.
We did 2 projects. I think they're both important in that they're both, when I look at Martin's big books of his career, big retrospective, and my own retrospective work edited by Val Williams, that was exhibited and also published as a book. These 2 pieces of work feature in both of those volumes. Butlins by the Sea and June Street. These were 2 things we did together. And we decided to try and do a job that would also mean that we'd be in a place where we could make our own pictures, responding to something around us. And Butlins was advertising for photographers to work through the season. So, you do pictures of campers, in a very regimented way. There were a whole load of exercises you had to work your way through, photographing campers doing various things. And then we responded to that. So we had a Leica with a big flash gun that they gave us. And then I also had my own Pentax with often with colour film in fact. Butlins didn't trust me to shoot colour film. It's quite difficult shooting colour and getting exposures right and so on. And so in our second year, we'd read that the Impressions Gallery in York was about to get going, and 2 people, Andy Sproxton and Val Williams, were about to open this gallery, the first photography gallery outside London and only the second one in the country. We went to see them, and we said, if you're going to have an exhibition of new and young contemporary photographers, we'd like to have a show. And they said, well, why don't you go and shoot something this summer? And if we like it, we might do it. And so we went to Butlins, and our objective was to try and respond to Butlins, to say something about it, and then to present it to Andy and Val and say, do a show. And they did. They liked the work we produced. And it ended up being the very first show at Impressions Gallery in November.
Yeah, there's that nice picture of you and Martin Parr in the exhibition, I think, and there is that little collage of pictures that were put together, which were colour photographs.
Yes,
and
exactly.
they were the only colour photographs in the exhibition.
Yes, yes. My little colour pictures, yeah.
Yes. Which are kind of Martin Parr-esque, dare I say.
Yes, well, I don't think I taught him anything to do with colour, but it is slightly ironic. It was 10 years before Martin started working in colour, and at that time, black and white was the colour of photography. I mean, colour was technically difficult, and the photographers that we admired. Bill Brandt and so on worked in black and white, but then Cartier-Bresson actually wrote in his essay on the decisive moment that actually it was pretty much impossible to work in colour. He tried, but Bresson was never happy working in black and white. And then people like the new ones coming over from America that we admired, people like Gary Winogrand and Diane Arbus, they were working in black and white as well. So to work in colour would have been quite exceptional, but I don't know why.
What was the spark then to put that colour film in?
It was a very colourful place, I think, and that was where we first came across the John Hind postcards, and I collected most of the postcards, certainly all the ones of Butlins Filey, which is where we were in Yorkshire. And I liked those colour pictures, and I just. I didn't shoot it all in colour. I shot some in black and white, but I got. As time went by, I became rather fond of all those. Yeah,
there's that some lovely pictures of that lovely mural in Filey and that domed building.
Yes, the domed building, extraordinary. The Dome of Fun and Fortune. Yeah. I mean, years later, I discovered that. Butlin was a clever guy. He was starting to build his holiday camps in the 1930s. And then the war came, and far from seeing this as a disadvantage, he exploited the fact by persuading the military, who obviously wanted military bases on the coast facing Germany, to build his camps for him, but to use them as military bases, and then he would get them back after the war if they hadn't been destroyed. And so, of course, they weren't destroyed. So, yes, it was called hutment accommodation. So the chalets were actually originally occupied by soldiers before they became holiday camps. And so the bases actually the holiday camps, had a number of old military buildings in them.
Yes.
And it was years later when I started getting interested in multimedia, I was giving a talk in Newcastle, and a very nice local curator from a museum saw that dome, the Dome of Fun and Fortune, and he said, give me a few minutes and I'll work out what that is. And he came back at the end of the talk and he said, I found, and he had some other pictures, I found what that was. And it was built as an anti-aircraft gun training tool. They used to project images of German bombers coming over onto the ceiling of this dome, on the inside, obviously, and they'd have a pair of gunners, the trainer and the one who was being trained, sitting in a double gun with the ACAC gun pointing, and they had to shoot them down. And you knew whether you'd shot them down because it fired a yellow light, which you couldn't see if you were shooting, but it was because it was filtered out for you. But the trainer could see where the yellow light struck the roof.
There's another marvellous photograph of a girl who'd made her own costume, and it's fringed, and they're kind of really modern although they are of their age, but they're very kind of modern.
Mark Bolan fan, wasn't she?
Yeah,
a T-Rex fan.
Yeah.
Ride a White Swan. Yes, they. At the time, I just was taking pictures and responding, and but yes, with hindsight, a lot of people have looked at those pictures and goes, "Oh, that's where Martin Parr got it from." But it isn't. He didn't. No. But I mean, it was just one of those coincidences. And I wish I'd shot more colour. I mean, I'd have shot a lot more in colour if I'd been able to control it. The problem with colour was that I rapidly became a photographer who wanted to work in the community, which meant that I was shooting pictures and giving them away, and as a way of getting to know people. And colour was hopelessly expensive. I would never have been able to raise the money to shoot colour in those circumstances. And you couldn't do it immediately. You sent stuff off and it came back a week later or something. It wasn't possible to do that. Not unless you had real money, and I never had real money. Whereas black and white, you could process, in the corner of a room in a dustbin if you needed to.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Because I remember why I shot transparencies from the age of 11 onwards, I have no idea. I still have the yellow boxes at home.
Brilliant.
But it was waiting for those yellow boxes to arrive. And
so exciting.
It's so exciting. Unbelievably exciting, really. And discovering that you weren't really as good a photographer as you thought you were, because it's that... that's, I suppose, what digital does to you. It allows you to reframe quickly, and whereas that taught you... Yeah,
you've got whatever it is, 24 frames or 36 frames, and it's costing you, every time you press the button, it's costing money. Yes. So you're, when you don't have any money, these things are running through the back of your head.
Yes.
With digital, okay, they are costing you money because the camera's expensive and digital cameras are upgraded every couple of years. But actually, at the moment when you're pressing the button, it doesn't feel like it's costing you any money because all you've got to do is take that card out and stick it in your computer and you can see it straight away.
Yeah. And I suppose we have to talk about the famous photograph of the lady being thrown into the pool or falling in.
Yes.
Did you have no compulsion to stop her from falling in?
That's terrible, isn't it? It's very naughty. I mean, who knows? I was 19. I was a lad, 20 maybe. I was 20 when I went to Butlins. But, so all the girls got pushed in the pool, So maybe some lad said to me something like, "We're going to go after her, get ready with your camera." "Oh yeah, right." And then I was just thinking, "Oh, wait a minute, there's a moral responsibility here. I could have prevented that from happening." But on the other hand, the girls who were hanging around the pool, around the lads who were going to push them in, they knew what was going to happen. So
independence seems to be, and your independent nature. Did you learn that by going to public school? Was that ingrained in you that you were able to survive and think on for your own and be able to make decisions?
Well, maybe. I mean, who knows? Maybe. But I never felt like any kind of a success.
Right. Okay.
At all. Not for many. Well, yeah. I mean, I would say that most of my life I've not felt like any kind of a success, and I certainly didn't feel like any kind of a success at school or afterwards. I mean, I think one of the things that was probably most important for me growing up was that even though my parents had sent me away, and even though they were very buttoned up 1950s types, who'd lived through a war and all of that, I knew I was loved. It wasn't like people I know who've come from broken homes or who really felt rejected or who spent time in Borstals or something. And I would think of being in a borstal would be pretty much like being in the school that I was in. But I did know I was loved, and I think knowing you're loved is a really important thing growing up. And knowing you're loved means that you're forgiven a lot.
Yes.
Because love is more important than... it allows you to fail.
Yeah.
The thing that probably I've tried to do all my life is to embrace difference. If we as human beings can't embrace that which is different about each of us, not only as a way of trying to understand each other, but as a way of being able to celebrate each other, then I think the human race isn't going to progress very well. And the country that I grew up in was a country, probably still is, but it was, certainly the family I grew up in was really quite snobby, very censorious about other people and other people's behaviour. You know, my mother was very strict with the way we used language. Like, we wouldn't be calling this room a lounge, we'd be calling it a drawing room. You would never say tar, you'd always say thank you, you know, and so on. And these weren't just bad uses of language or imprecise uses of language. These were class-specific terminologies, and I was raised with all of that very, very, very strictly. So when I was, 19 or 20 and I was away from the immediate influence of my parents, I didn't have to observe all of that. And I was among a lot of other people who, whereas previously I would have been protected from them, I now wanted to embrace them, but we were complete strangers. And in Britain, the class divide then, and still, I believe, to a certain extent, is still a real barrier between people. We can't find ways of talking. We use a class-specific way of speaking, which the other person responds to not because of the words they're hearing, but because of the way they're spoken. And so there is this inbuilt strangeness. I think it's particularly true in Britain, where we've had this history of empire as well, because, in my lifetime, I'd never met a black person until I went to live in Manchester. I had never met any women either, really. So, there were all these strangenesses that I first encountered when I was a student.
Yes.
Colour and gender being, just two. Whereas now, kids just about anywhere in the country will mix across the gender and race divides in a way that we didn't. So it was very, very pronounced for me, and photography was the tool that was enabling me to break that down for myself, and then to try and build work that was able to celebrate difference rather than differentiate difference.
Hence setting up the shop then.
Yes, at the same year that I went to Butlins, I opened a little shop, 1972, in Graham Street in Moss Side. And Moss Side was being demolished. In the early 70s, all of our inner cities, particularly in the Midlands and the North, were all the old Victorian housing stock was demolished and rebuilt with, walkways in the sky and, all these great new adventures that we now subsequently have come to regret. But at the time, there was this sort of brave new world of wiping out the past. And it seemed to me it happened so quickly. You'd go away for a college holiday over Easter or something, you come back and a whole street had disappeared. And so I thought, by opening a shop, instead of behaving like a journalist and kind of dropping in on the place and, lining people up and getting them to pose in houses that were, substandard or something, rather than producing those kind of pictures, which I could see all around me anyway in magazines and newspapers, maybe if I was to stay still and people would come to me, then maybe I might hear stories that I might not hear in other ways. And I started, this rather clumsy little studio that I opened on Saturdays in an old barber shop. And you're instantly invaded by a million kids, so I tried to give them things to do, like distribute the photographs and so on. And, people came and I made portraits of them. And I also began making audio recordings then. The earliest audio recordings I have were done in that shop. It's the only one that survives, is a little girl called Angela, who was 8, who was a mixed-race child. She must be in her, mid-50s now. And she sings this song about bonfire night. She goes, "Bonfire night, stars are bright, 3 little Indians dressed in white, one with a gun, one with a drum, and one with a banger stuck up his bum, bang." It was the earliest recording I have of my attempts to try and record people, to be another dimension to the photograph, as it were.
Which was the preamble to things that happened
much later
in your
and
career.
and then Martin and I collaborated again in our final year. In the spring of our final year, we photographed everyone living in a street that was about to be demolished in Salford. It's called June Street, and we photographed it with the college Hasselblad. We had a devil of a job persuading the technician to let us take the Hasselblad out of the art school into the streets of Salford to photograph these people night after night. But we did, and that became I think it became quite an important document. And I learned a lot from that, shooting that body of work, because I was trying to raise money for another project, which was the Free Photographic Omnibus at that time, which was, we might come on to talk about. But I wanted to put my shop on wheels, but I needed to raise money to do that. And I didn't really know how to go about that. But one of the things I did was I thought media might be important. So I started contacting the local, BBC, ITV and so on, and saying, this is what I'd like to do. And when I was at the BBC in Manchester, they said, well, what have you got? What are you doing already? And I said, oh, we've got this thing we're doing in June Street. And they went, wait, do you want Dennis? Come on. And they sent a researcher down who interviewed the people that we were photographing. I don't have any of those tapes, sadly. I have a transcript of the tape the producer had, which he gave me when the programme was finished. And we got paid 10 quid, I remember, for the use of the pictures. I found this profoundly empowering, the idea that me, a student, could photograph these people in this street and that we could kind of give them a voice. Because the sort of politics of it was, hooray, we're wiping out the horrible housing, and sure enough, this housing was pretty horrible. We're wiping it out, and we're building new things, homes for people to live in. But the people who lived in those houses were also house-proud people, who felt that these things were their homes. And whilst they didn't mind about things being redeveloped, they didn't like the idea that they were grubby people, that the grubbiness was something that was their responsibility. And they were people who regularly papered over the cracks in these falling down houses to keep them smart. So we kind of gave them a voice.
Yes.
And it was broadcast on the TV. And I remember that being for me, that was a really big deal, that we were reaching this massive audience on regional TV in Manchester with this little thing that was just me and Martin posting notes through people's doors and banging on the doors and persuading them to be photographed sitting in their front rooms. What
lessons should we learn from what you were doing then, and what should be applied to today?
I think we've gone backwards because there's almost no place where people's voices can be heard, or the way our society has developed and the way our media communications have developed have always been in ways where it's been commodified. So where people might have a voice through, say, social media or whatever, it's been commodified by Facebook and Twitter, who basically are building echo chambers for people to rant in, and they're paying for it by advertising. And so people are being encouraged to be anonymous, and so you just have whenever I look at Facebook, it's just peppered with abusive posts by people who are hiding behind anonymity in one way or another, and I find that incredibly sad. Whereas in a mature society, it should be possible for, given that we have universal education from the age of 5, so people are spending as Bob Dylan said, 20 years of school and then they put you on the day shift. We don't even have a day shift now. They put you on a 0 hours contract, cleaning the floors somewhere, doing the horrible jobs that no one else wants to do.
Where are there? I can't think of people who are working in these communities as photographers.
There are some things going on.
Okay.
I've recently done some work for Multistory in the West Midlands, which is a community arts organisation where they bring people in, like Susan Mercelis and Martin Parr, well-known photographers come and work with people in communities on very specific projects. My project there, I worked was doing something called High Street Stories, where the High Street there's basically shut down and been turned into market stalls.
Yes.
And I spent time with the market stall holders and with the people who buy things in the market and people who wander through and so on. Just trying to get a feel for what this place is like. It's very threatened. It's working at about 20-25% capacity, barely hanging in there. And yet so you're looking at people who are at in many ways at the bottom of the pile in our community. So I think there are people, but they're few and far between, and it's very difficult to get any funding to do that.
Yes,
that kind of work.
I worked for a while with a boxing club in Tylerstown, which was a remarkable place. It was above a garage, and it was an old dance hall, which I quite liked the idea of a boxing club in an old dance hall. It was dirty, it was hard, but the people were genuine and generous and softly spoken, and came from all over. They came from Port Talbot up to this club because it was a good club. The guys there, the coaches there, were really good guys, and the cut man. I met the cut man. He was a man and a half. But what transpired was that there was this huge web of stories which were underlying the story of the boxing club. Was fine, yes, but they were from Penrhys, which is a very
I know Penrhys, high up, 70s housing development,
known as the High Chaparral. Really rough.
Yeah.
The amount of storytelling that could go on there could last a lifetime.
Yes, absolutely, and of course, just because people don't have a voice doesn't mean they don't have stories, and so although I was photographically, I'm probably better known for the work I did when I was very young. The work that has really mattered to me in Wales has been the work I did with the BBC around digital storytelling, which was, something that happened at the turn of the millennium, where we started helping people to put together a voice, a recorded voice, with the still pictures that they might have in any family photo albums or shoe boxes or whatever, because that's what people had. They had memory, and they had a few boxes of old photographs. But you could put these two together and make something that was an elegant piece of multimedia. And so, basically all my life I've been trying to marry storytelling with pictures, sometimes with myself being the editor. But editing is the most powerful tool of communication. And so from 2000 onwards, from 2000 until 2008, I was involved with coming up with the digital storytelling project that we took to the BBC Capture Wales, and trying to help people to find their own voice in the community by making something that was elegant. What I liked about digital storytelling, which was a media form that I learned in America while doing research, was that it is an elegant means of communication, particularly for people who are coming to multimedia for the first time, which in 2000 was all of us, really, because the tools for being able to marry sound and picture together were for the first time affordable. Up to then, they were industrial tools that really you only got access to if you were a member of the union and you had a big budget. Now they were things you could do on the kitchen table and a laptop computer. And I had this belief that if we could take that laptop computer and the kitchen table, or rather out into the kitchen tables of the communities of Wales, we could come up with a way of storytelling that might perhaps be a model for small nations, particularly for small nations where there's, fractured communities. Like Wales has a large Welsh-speaking community, which, in a way only has a media voice through, there's a bit of radio and there's a bit of S4C. But if you live on this side, the east side of Wales, you'd be forgiven for knowing there were Welsh speakers. And the culture that language reveals. For me, the thing that I learned a lot about Wales doing digital storytelling, but the thing I learned most was not that I felt disempowered by not speaking Welsh. I'd love to have learnt Welsh as a younger person, but that as an adult whose ability to learn anything new becomes harder and harder. But what I did learn was the culture that kind of underpinned the language. Mm-hmm. And so I had the team that we gradually built to enable us to have 2 digital storytelling teams out working in the community, working in pubs and miners' institutes and welfare halls and so on, working with 10 people at a time. These 2 groups, one was essentially a Welsh language workshop and the other was an English language workshop. And there was some overlap. Some of the people worked in both. And occasionally they sneaked me onto the Welsh language one. I learned so much about what it meant to be Welsh and also what it meant to the different kind of Welsh that you spoke. Yeah. Because, this was the year 2000, 2001, 2002 when I was getting the project going. We were 30 years on from the great 60s and 70s revolution in starting to celebrate Welsh as language and then getting it being taught in schools and so on. Because we were now dealing with a generation who maybe spoke their Welsh clumsily, but with incredible spirit. There was a real dilemma at the BBC, the BBC wants to be celebrating the language, but it wants to be celebrating it correctly. Mm. Whereas we had people who were speaking Welsh and bunging in English words and all kind of Irish phrases and God knows what, but they were kids in particular, doing it with enthusiasm. And the difficulty we had a lot of difficulty trying to get those kind of stories on air because there was a real reluctance to...
The bureaucracy.
Yes, there's a real... Well, I don't know, it wasn't... That area wasn't my job. I wasn't the person whose job it was to sell our work within the BBC, but I'd get them telling me, it would come back to me, well, we've got a real problem with this story because, this teenage girl, whoever, doesn't speak Welsh well enough, and stuff. So I began to realise that there's a whole hierarchy within Welsh language speaking, which was problematic for
a snobbery.
Yeah, maybe. And
linguistic snobbery.
Yeah, and learn, the things I learned. Forgive me, because I don't come from a Welsh-speaking area, and I'm not a Welsh speaker. But what I did know was that there were people I knew who were maybe born and bred in Swansea, who had learnt their Welsh orally because it wasn't allowed to be taught in the school, and who had a way of speaking Welsh that maybe couldn't be understood in Carmarthen. And that not only could it not be understood in Carmarthen, but in other areas of Swansea, pegged that person to having been working in that steelworks or that factory.
Yes, indeed.
Or lived in that street. And therefore people were, there was not just the fact that you spoke Welsh might be a problem, but the fact that your Welsh was not good enough. And that seems to me, the language that of your dreams and your parents and your home isn't good enough. Good enough for what?
And the same thing persists to this day. There tends to be what I call the language police. They will jump on you if you mutate incorrectly or whatever. But and I take you back a little because everything worked together, didn't it? There was a progression, even if things were serendipitous. They all culminated in the digital story.
Well, it was. The digital storytelling project was a very Daniel-shaped project.
Yes.
With hindsight, it's easy to put shape on it. But as soon as I saw how easy it was in the digital age to start putting pictures and words, sound together and edit them into something that was a nice thing to look at and a good thing to hear. I thought, blimey, all the work I've been doing up to now starts to make sense, Because when I'd finished running my shop and finished at Manchester Polytechnic back in 1973, I needed a project to encapsulate all the things that I'd been learning at college, and that was the Free Photographic Omnibus.
Yes.
And the digital storytelling project at the BBC was really very close in spirit to the bus.
Yeah.
But they were different and of their time, you know. So the bus project was simple enough. Take my shop from Graham Street in Moss Side, where people would come to me, have a free picture taken, but we'd talk. And then they'd come back the next day and collect the picture, and we'd talk again. And they'd tell me about things that were going on outside in the community that I might want to photograph. That seems such a nice model if you put that on wheels and drive around the country. So I thought this is what I'd like to do. And so I'd buy a bus like Cliff Richard in Summer Holiday. But, you know, I spent most of my final year at art school raising the money to do that. And so, you know, again, it's in the digital age, we'd call that crowdfunding.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I learnt that I could get money from the Arts Council, but they'd only really match money that you already were able to find. So I, you know, wrote 10 letters. I went to the Central Reference Library in Manchester, where, you know, Marx and Engels had written the condition of the working class. Anyway, done some of their research, Engels anyway. And I, you know, pulled out the dictionary of directors and the, I don't know, I can't remember. There were various industrial catalogues you could pull off the shelf. And I just wrote 10 letters a day to captains of industry saying, I'm going to do this, you know, and give me some money, basically. Or,
did they give you money?
Yeah, well, mostly people gave me things in kind, like Calagas gave me free gas, and Sun Alliance gave me free insurance, and so on. And I was able to kind of persuade.
So you were living on this bus. This was
and then I got an Arts Council grant, and then I had money from the regional arts associations, and so I was able to divide the country up into the chunks where people had sponsored me, and I'd go and spend. The general idea was to spend 6 weeks in each area, so I'd spend 4 weeks actually on the road. I'd run a free studio in a different town once a week, and then I'd spend the rest of the time following up on any stories that came out of those meetings I had with people. Then I'd spend 2 weeks back in Manchester, where I was a postgraduate. I was a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies. And I'd print up an exhibition, which I'd then give to the Regional Arts Association in that area. And I'd have 2 copies of it. One of them would be in the windows of the bus, and the other I'd give to the locality, which would go up in libraries or wherever. And then I'd move on to the next place. And, I did that for 14 months. Yeah. And did 10,000 miles. And
how many rolls of film?
Oh, I did count, actually. I could tell you that. I do know.
I think it's about 356 or something.
You've been on my website. Yeah, it was, you know. But by today's standards, hardly any pictures at all.
Exactly, yeah.
Because I was always short of money. I mean, I never raised the money I really needed to do the project.
You worked with Ken Russell, didn't you?
I did. I worked in the film industry, yeah.
What was he like to work with, or did he give you free range?
He was difficult because he was an old man by then, quite grumpy. He was very egocentric. But having said that, what I loved about Ken Russell was that if you read the script, you could see the pictures. Working for Ken Russell and for Tony Palmer introduced me to not only music that was new to me, modern contemporary music that was new to me, but also some great actors and great characters. Yeah, so I did get to photograph Olivier, Gielgud, and Richardson, and so I got some nice work done with him. Yeah, that was all in the late 80s and into the 90s. Yeah.
I have to ask you about the Margaret Thatcher encounter.
Yes.
It's if you could relive that moment for me, that would be rather nice.
Well, yes, it was celebrating for God's sake. Wow. I feel guilty. I mean, if I feel guilty about that young chambermaid being pushed into the swimming pool at Butlins, I feel much more guilty about photographing Mrs. Thatcher, because I really loathed everything to do with her project completely. The Tory project is still a shocker. Anyway, 10 years at number 10, there was a book, and they wanted me to shoot some pictures for it. And I thought, well, you know, part of why I became a photographer was to mix between the social classes. I'm not going to get to spend, 40 minutes alone with the Prime Minister in any other way. And being a photographer is, a passport to being able to do that. So I weighed it up with my conscience, and I thought, okay, well, it's going to happen anyway. It might as well be my picture. So I did. I photographed her for this book. She was very bossy, and although we had all this agreed things that I was allowed and not allowed to do, I had to have a fixed flash on the camera or in my hand. I wasn't allowed to have it on a stand. I had to agree to her locations where she wanted the pictures taking, which were all different rooms in number 10. And then we had to do another day in the Houses of Parliament in her office there. And it happened to be the day of the Lockerbie announcement, when the bomb was planted on the plane over Christmas and just before Christmas, and plane going back to America full of lots of students on board, and it crashed and a lot of people were killed. And she was making the announcement about how the government was going to respond to this, and consequently our appointment was pushed back half an hour. I said to a secretary person, can I go in and just do some flash tests? Oh, don't know, a desk hasn't been tidied, but if you must, So I went in and fired off a few frames, and eventually she came out, and it was, she was good. She gave me the time, and God, who'd want to be a politician when you've got to make an announcement like that, and then you come in and there's some photographer who wants to take your picture, But I don't feel sorry for Mrs. Thatcher at all, by the way. But just, she did give me the time, and I took the pictures, and I basically handed the film in. There were rules about they wanted everything I shot had to be given to the publisher, and then that all had to go for vetting. I don't know why. There were issues to do with security. They were very jumpy about the IRA. There'd been this big attempt on her life and so on. So the film ends that when you take your film along to Joe's basement. There's the ones they mount in the slide mounts, and then there's the film ends, which is just when you're winding the film into the camera. I just tucked those into the box with the rest, and basically gave it to the publisher and said, "There you are," and waited for the paycheck. And I thought, that's it. And then some months passed, and I got a phone call from the picture editor of the Express magazine, weekly supplement. He said, I've rung to congratulate you on the Thatcher pictures. He said, we're going to run a cover and a double spread. And I said, what's the double spread? He said, need you ask? He said, absolutely brilliant. You're the first person to get a picture of Mrs. Thatcher's handbag. And I went, this is the handbag shot. And of course, I wasn't going to own up. What's he talking about? The handbag shot? And of course, these film ends, when I was doing the flash tests, I hadn't noticed, but her handbag was on the table. and I just fired off a few slightly out of focus pictures of her handbag on. Anyway, so the handbag shot. And he said, I'd done a deal because I didn't want it to be a sort of PR snow job. So I said, I want to keep. They wouldn't let me keep the rights to the British rights, but they did let me keep the foreign rights. And he said, and do you know who owns the foreign rights? And I said, well, actually, that's me. He said, good, so we'll make the check out to you. I said, why? Who have you sold it to? We've sold it to Paris Match, he said. So, that's the story of, how I made, whatever it was, £263.40 out of Mrs. Thatcher's handbag.
You had a foray into television with Granada, and the John Savage and Factory Records.
So back to the chronology then. So it was art school, then the bus, then I was artist in residence to the borough of Pendle in Lancashire, which was a fantastic time, a really, really important time in my development as a photographer, really, and a storyteller. And then I started having a family, and I didn't want to become a commercial photographer. And I started teaching and came to Wales, worked with David Hearn at Newport, and that's why I'm here. And I've spent half my life living it. We came in 1983, so I spent more than half my life living in Wales.
you became a teacher of photography. You joined the Hearn. I wouldn't call it an experiment, but
well, I think it was an experiment, but it was a very successful one, and I was lucky to join it at a time when it had already proved its success. I didn't come to Wales till '83, and David had already been teaching the course for 10 years by then, or nearly 10 years. It was fantastic. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy that you can't teach photography in public institutions like that anymore. You know, we had 5 members of staff. I was the 5th to be appointed, and 25 students. So a staff-student ratio of 1:5 in a public art school, unheard of these days. And David had broken down how to teach photography into a grammar, like teaching, words and then constructions of sentences. He taught these, he had 5 simple briefs, being able to master 5 different kinds of photograph, and then being able to put them together as a story. The people who don't like the course or the way, or people who were never on the course but who hear about it go, that sounds very prescriptive, like you can only do it in one way, or you're going to do it this way, you can't do it that way. It was never like that. It was just like giving people a grammar. Then you can flower. But if you don't have the basic grammar, you're not ever going to flower, So, and also I think it was based around that thing where, I can't remember who said it, but how many hours it is. But there's this thing about, is it 10,000 hours? If you don't start thinking you can do something until you've put the time in.
I think Bresson said you have to take 10,000 photographs before you're any good.
But but before you can know whether you're any good, really.
Exactly, yes.
And you put the time in, and the students were expected to shoot pictures every day. They had a critique on those pictures every day. Even if they had lectures, they were still expected to produce a set of contact sheets of something they'd done that day. And we were expected to crit every student every day. And, that meant that the students shot a lot of pictures in the time that they were there. That was very special. No, David is a very special man, and he came up with a very special way of teaching photography. And when I was teaching digital storytelling at the BBC, I built our workshop model around the same kind of disciplines as we had at Newport. And I learned a lot from David, and I owe him a lot. And I'm a big fan of his. Yeah.
Education-wise, I mean, things have changed radically, I guess. There seem to be a lot of photographic courses turning out a lot of students. Do you have an opinion on that?
I do, yeah. I mean, my view is that it's terribly sad that you can't run the course like we used to have at Newport. And the reason you can't is because politicians decided that art schools had to become universities, that we had to move from 2-year courses to 3-year courses, that everything had to be a degree, that they weren't going to increase the student numbers enormously, but they weren't going to increase the number of people to teach them. So if you've gone from having 5 students to having 25, you can't give them a crit every day. You just wouldn't be able to manage that. So you have to get them in a lecture theatre, and you've got to start talking at them. And the way that you're going to measure what they've done is by getting them to write something. So we turned something that was essentially a practical program into one that's essentially a theoretical one. So photography's moved from being like teaching documentary photography, like we were doing, moved to being teaching something that was now conceptual. I've got nothing against conceptual art or conceptual photography. I go to exhibitions by, conceptual artists and enjoy it. But it wiped out something else. Why does, it is not progress here that we have to report. We are moving backwards. Something's been destroyed in order to accommodate a political expediency, not to think about what's best for students. We had a 2-year BTEC diploma at Newport on that course were, yes, kids who came off YTS schemes, youth training schemes, which were basically a solution to unemployment things in the 1980s. We had older men in particular who'd been made redundant from the steelworks, Llanwern and so on in Newport. But we also had people like Simon Norfolk and Paul Lowe, who were Oxbridge graduates. Because there were no proper postgrad courses for training photographers, you had Oxbridge graduates who could, who knew their Latin and were very articulate and so on, mixing with kids off the dole queue in one course. What a brilliant educational experience that was for both of them.
Exactly.
And on a small course where everybody knows everybody else and where there's a handful of teachers who know everybody and who are intimately involved in each one's development. I mean, it was a hothouse. It was incredibly intense.
Small is beautiful, really. And it's now become, it seems to me, like a money-making exercise.
Well, they've folded. They don't even have a photography course in Newport anymore.
No, indeed.
It's closed down. And that, you just think, my God, this is... I know old men always sit around grumbling, saying it wasn't like this in my day. Yeah. But it really wasn't. They've really... Government is going to be held to account in years to come for what it did to art education in Britain.
Yes.
The abandonment of the workshop, studio approach, where you have an artist sitting down working with people, with young apprentices who are learning from them. The abandoning of that was terrible. I went on to teach after Newport. I went on to teach at Cardiff, which is a Russell Group university. I went there. I did a PhD. I've got nothing against. I've got everything for proper academic education. Don't get me wrong, but in order to do that, you don't have to kill off the other thing. The two things can work together. And people with PhDs can learn to take pictures. And people without PhDs can learn to be articulate about the process of the world around them and what they're learning and understanding. All my education came to me, all the education I really value came to me through going out and making pictures, particularly when I was living on my bus or living in Moss Side or going to Butlins or working as an artist in residence in Pendle in the mid-70s, or revisiting these projects years later. All of my education, all of the things I really value about my own learning have come through photography. But nevertheless, I've taught academics at postgraduate level in a Russell Group university, and I've taught them things, that have to be answered with essays and so on. Yes. I'm not opposed to conventional academic training. I'm a big enthusiast for it, but I'm also an enthusiast for something that is a workshop art school model, which is now long forgotten, and it's a tragedy that we've lost it, because it was one of the things that we were so good at in Britain. We were really, really good at it, and we threw it away for political expediency. I have such a loathing for social media, mainly because it's a commodification of communication around advertising, and it allows for anonymity. Which in other words plays to our worst base instincts. It allows us to be cruel and rude about people without there being any comeback, because we can pretend that we aren't who we are. Whereas digital storytelling was about. Well, it was about a lot of things, but ultimately it was about dignity. That we need to celebrate each other's dignity, and we need to be dignified in the process of doing that. And in that way, we can grow, and we can learn by sharing, and we can not be cruel about each other. And all I see as I grow old is a world where we're learning, increasingly to be increasingly cruel about each other. So maybe some of those teachers, I was once, one school I was at was basically a Quaker foundation. So maybe a lot of the things you're hearing now are me regurgitating the things I learned in, silent prayer on a Sunday morning, sitting in serried ranks in a Quaker school when I was 9. I don't know. But no, I think that we've lost something with the end of... When digital storytelling ended, it was a litmus paper in the culture that we are. Now we have, President Trump, king of the tweets. Need I say more?